Hello and welcome back to another episode of Let's Build an E-commerce Store with a Spring Boot Backend. Episode 11 is going to be on unit testing. This is the first part of it. The objectives for our unit testing sub-series is firstly we need to build unit tests to test our code for us. Up to this point, every time that we've gone to run a JUnit to run a test on some of the code we've written, we've gone into Postman and executed it manually. But realistically, to make sure that we're continuously testing our code, we need to write unit tests that automate this test, so that every time that we write some code, we can not only just test what we're writing, but also all the other elements of the software to ensure that everything is being retested and everything isn't being, some other part of the program has been broken by what we have done. Secondly, the only other objective is to aim for as high of a code coverage result while being realistic. Now, what do I mean by that? So code coverage is a statistic that's drawn up to say how many classes, how many methods, and how many lines of a program has been run during unit test. This gives an indication to how well the program's been unit tested. Now, it doesn't give you a straight, clear-cut answer because you could have code coverage 100% of your system, but you may not be properly testing it. The tests itself are where you diagnose, am I doing the right test cases, at the outlying cases, but the code coverage really diagnosed to say, are we even bothering to test most of it? Because for example, I could see that we are testing that a user exists in the database, but we haven't tested what happens if a user doesn't exist in the database. What does this method that we're testing do? Well, if we don't test that, our code coverage will show that the else statement of the if statement isn't being run. Now, code coverage is usually run in Java using Jarcoco, which is the kind of newer modern alternative to Kobatura, if you're more familiar with that one. But I believe we're going to use IntelliJ for this, and I believe under the hood it uses Jarcoco. So, and then when I say realistic, I mean not every single line of code needs to be unit tested. If you have a once in a billion exception that's going to be thrown based on some use case that never would happen, maybe you don't need to test that. Maybe you don't need a line for that. If you've got, say, for example, the example of what we're going to see today is if you've got a data object, like our user object, for example, our local user object, where you've got lots of gets and set methods. Now, you may not use all those get and set methods, but in the future, you're going to need them. So it's realistic to say that our data models, they don't need 100% code coverage because those get and set methods aren't being called, and that's right that they're not being called. So that's where the realisticness of it comes in. Now, obviously, with code coverage tools, you can actually specify, ignore this package. So you could tell it to ignore the data model package, for example. But I like to keep it in there just so you have an idea that it's existing and we are scanning it. So, with that done, like I said, this is going to be a multi-part episode because there's quite a lot of code that we've already written. We need to unit test. But once we get over that, we'll then start to look at the order system. How do we take in orders? And we're going to start looking at other bits and pieces of the software that we need to build as well. So, let's get into the dev environment and get on with it. Okay, so here we are back in the dev environment. So, when we start to do our unit tests, there's a few things we need to think about. The first thing that I want us to think about is what external systems are we currently using when our application runs? So aside from obviously the website that would call the REST API to get the figures and print them on the screen, what other services or applications or whatever do we need to connect to? So the first thing we need to obviously have is a database. Now, having SQL Server running and in the background just to run the unit tests is quite a bloaty application just for unit tests. So what we usually do in Java is we have a embedded variation of a SQL dialect. Now, the common one for Java is called H2. And H2 is a database engine. It's quite lightweight, written in Java, that you can actually have embedded into the application so that when your application starts, it starts a database inside of itself. So to add that to our application, we need to come into our pom.xml and I'm going to come down to here where it's got the other test packages here, we can see. And I'm going to drop down here and go new dependency. And we're going to look for the dependency called H2. And it doesn't seem to be here, so I'm going to write the group ID itself. So we can just type in com.h2 database. And we want to scope this to be for test only. And that should work if we just refresh. Because I believe the H2 dependency isn't explicitly defined, but the version that's supported is defined within the Spring Boot parent. So all we've got to do is add this, and it will add it for us. So that's brilliant. And then the other thing that we need to think about that we connect to is our SMTP server for the emails, the email server. Again, the best way to do this is to have an embedded service, but rather than having an embedded service, because we don't want to connect to something and send emails out and all this, we actually want something that allows us to kind of read those emails as they get sent. Because if we do a test where we send out an email for verification, well, we want to verify that the email was sent, all right? So there's a nice little dependency out there called Greenmail. So if we search for Greenmail, and we're actually going to search for Greenmail-JUnit5, because we're going to use JUnit5 for this tutorial. And we can see the group ID is com.icegreen. And we're just going to take the 2.0.0 alpha 2. Now, at the time of the recording, version 2 is in alpha. Now, version 2 is what you're going to need if you're using JDK 17 or above, because JDK 17 has renamed some of the packages and reworked a bit of the way the Java mail system works. So to be able to support that, you need to use version 2. Now, when you watch this, they might have already released version 2 or 2.1, for example. So you may want to use the latest one. Obviously, bear in mind, if you're watching this in a year's time and it's version 3, well, you need to be careful what the difference between version 2 and 3, because they may cause the JUnits not to work. But we're going to have version 2.0.0 alpha 2 is the one we're going to use for this tutorial, just for the moment. And then while we're in the POM, I'd just like to note that during the recording of my tutorial, I've been using Spring version 3.0.0-RC1. At the time of recording, a couple of days ago, they released Spring Boot version 3 officially. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to remove the RC1. We're going to come down here and I'm going to remove these repositories for the Spring milestone stuff, because again, we don't need those because the full version of Spring Boot is released on the Maven Central repository. And then we just hit refresh on the Maven, and we should see it pick up everything, re-download the new dependencies, and it shouldn't have any problems with any of these either, I would hope. So we'll just see here, it's downloading, importing Maven projects, and there we go, everything's good. We've got no errors. There's this error, but I'm pretty sure that's a false positive on IntelliJ's behalf. So there we go. That's our updated POM. The next thing that we need to consider is when the database starts, and we are currently using this, if we go to application.properties, we're using this DDL auto, where it updates, and what that does is it creates a new schema for the database automatically from the files. Now in the future, we may be making another episode tutorial, we may change this to use some other sort of schema generation tool. But for the time being, we're using that. So when the application starts, it's going to connect to the database and it will just generate the schema, but there's no data in it. And obviously, with some of our unit tests, we're going to want to have some data in there. So what we need to do is auto insert some data. Now, where is it? So if we come under test, we can go right click and go new directory and resources. And this will be our test resources folder. And then we can go for a new file and we can type in data.sql. Now when Spring Boot loads, it's configured to load a data.sql and a schema.sql files from the resources folder. And that will load in all this default, it will run these bits of SQL for you on the start of the application. which is really handy for us in the test environment because we want to load some static data in there every time, so we've got some data to work with. So for this first episode, we're going to just focus on having some user tests. So let's insert some dummy data here for user. So we're going to write a comment. We're going to say passwords are in the format of password user letter 123 unless specified otherwise. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go insert into local user is the table that we create. Oh, helps if I spell insert right. And then we're going to specify the columns we're filling out. So we've got email in there, first name, last name, password, username, and we've got email underscore verified. And for the test we're going to write today, we're going to have two static users. We're going to have a user that is fully verified and a user that's not verified for the tests. So we're going to have values, and we're going to put in our values. So we've got user A at junit.com. So what I like to do is for an email, for all these fields, I like to call it a user with a letter or a number, maybe it's your preference, but a user, and every field has that user's like identifier inside it somewhere, so that you can. So when you're debugging through JUnits that aren't working properly, you can kind of go, "Oh, I'm looking at user A here, but I requested user B," so you know there's a problem. So we got so then our first name, we're going to give it user A first name, and likewise for the surname or the last name, should I say? Last name. And then password, as set up there, we're going to have password B123. Now you may have noticed there's a problem there, but we'll come back to it. And then user A. Oh, sorry, I don't know why I put B in these. It should be A. And then user A is the username, and we're going to put that as true for the email verified. And then one more set of data for user B at junit.com. User B first name, user B last name, and password B123, user B as the thing, and we're going to say they're not verified. Okay, so here we go. So as I said there, we can notice there's something wrong here. Now you may have noticed it, you may not have. When we save databases, when we save passwords to our database, we save them as an encrypted string. You might recall from the previous episode, we use our encryption service here. And what that does is it uses bcrypt, a encryption library, to hash the password based on our salt. Now, obviously, your salt is going to be different. So what you might want to do is lock this salt round down to 10 rounds in your application properties inside the test environment. But I'm just going to leave it as 10 for now because I'm not changing this anywhere. But you have a 10 number salt for your password, and when the password is installed in the database, it's not going to be password A123. It'll be some random array of strings or characters, should I say. And what that means is when the encryption service reads this password to verify it for, against a password that we use in a unit test to log in, for example, well, we're going to actually encounter an error where we get this password is an invalid hash, or it doesn't match the hashed version of the password we've input. So what we need to do is we need to actually generate the hash for this. So there's two ways about this. You could, quickly write a public static main void, a void main even, somewhere in your code, and just use the bcrypt library to encode this password to yourself. But I have found there's a website online that's called javainuse.com/online bcrypt, and this website will actually encrypt it for you. And you can see it's already got the 10 rounds that we're using. So I can put in here password A123, generate bcrypt hash, and it gives me the hash to put in. So we can come in here and we can go and plop that in there, and we know that that's password A because we write our little comment up here, and it's now going to use that password. What I also like to do is, just for future reference, because you may come back to it and not know, you can come in here and you go encrypted using, and then paste the link. And then that way, if you need to come back in here and add another password in the future, you can already have the link to hand. So let's also get our password B for the user B account. And there we go. So let's copy that and drop that in there. Now, with my testing, this website has worked. There was another website that I used which creates bcrypt encoded hashes online, but it didn't actually work for me. So you may have to do some trial and error, but from my experience, this URL specifically does work. Okay, so now next we need to consider, if we look at our application.properties, our Spring data source URL is still pointing to our SQL Server. Now that's all good for our main application, but for our test system, we're using an embedded SQL Server. You know, the H2 database we used earlier. So what we need to do is we need a way of overwriting these. Now, one way you could do it is you could come into the resources down here inside your test and create a new file and call it application-test or tests.properties. And that hyphen indicates that you're talking about a profile, and the word after it, or the text after it, is your profile. Now, if you want to, I recommend maybe going looking into Spring profiles. They're quite handy. We might go into it in the future when we're maybe like making this application production ready. But at the moment, we're not going to go into that in too depth. But there's another way around it. In Spring, what you can do is you can create a config folder. Now, bear in mind, that's a file, not a folder. Now, this is very important. It has to be inside a folder called config. Now, if you had just created an application.properties here, new file, application.properties. If you had made one here, anything you write in here will be read, but it will not read this one. So all this other information that you've got in here, the JWT issuer, the email from, the app URL front end, all this information would not exist because it won't read it, because this file overwrites that file when it's compiled. However, if you were to put this application.properties inside your config folder, Spring actually reads the application.properties from your main application and then overrides anything with the ones that are in here. So what we can do is we can come in here and actually type in spring.datasource.url, and then this is the URL for setting up the H2 database for embedded. You can do jdbc h2 mem test. What this is saying is we're creating a JDBC URL. We're using the H2 driver. It's going to be an in-memory database, therefore it will get killed off once we finished our unit tests. And we're going to give the database name test. And then we don't need to specify a username or password because it's an in-memory, it doesn't authenticate. But what will happen is, when Spring loads, it will come in here, it will read this file and load all these properties up, and it will read Spring data source URL and keep this in. But then it will after that, read the config application.properties, read this, and overwrite the previous. So this is a way of overwriting properties. So for example, if you had that salt generation thing, you wanted it to be a constant for your tests, but it could be different in production, well, you could set that in here, for example. So there's some other things we want to set while we're here. So we want spring.jpa.properties.hibernate dialect, and we're going to set it to org.hibernate.dialect.h2 dialect. Now what this is saying is, as before, we are specifying that the dialect we're using is H2 rather than SQL Server, just in case it gets confused. And there's one more that we want to do here. Because the way that Spring works, sometimes it will, if you don't put in this extra property we're about to put in, what it will do is it will try and load the data.sql or the data.sql file before the auto DDL kicks in. or it might, randomly choose which one it runs first. And because of that, we don't want that happening, because we don't want the data.sql running before the structure's there. So if you put in the property spring.jpa.defer data source initialization and do true, what that will do is it will ensure that our AutoDDL, which is the thing that creates the database structure from Hibernate, runs first. When we go down the line, we use other data source structure builders. We won't necessarily need this property, but for now we do. So that's what we're going to put in there. And then some other bits and pieces that we need to add. We need to set up our mail configuration, because currently if we go in application at properties, we're pointing to our mail host of localhost 25, and that's not what we want. So what we're going to do is we're going to say spring.mail.port, and we're going to change the port because the default is 25. But as a developer, if you've got your fake SMTP server running, you don't want a port clash every time you run a unit test. It's going to be very annoying. So we're going to change it to 3025, and we'll specify that in configuration later. And then we've got spring.mail.username, and we're going to give it springboot. And spring.mail.password is equal to secret. And we'll set these up, all these in configuration. Another thing to note, application.properties inside resources, you currently got it pointing to localhost. If you're pointing this somewhere else, say for example a production SMTP server, in here, in your config one, you're going to need to specify that host as well. So, because obviously, if you're pointing it in the wrong place, it's going to go to the wrong place. So, that is the initial kind of setup for our little bits of data and around the unit tests. So let's start to dig into the unit tests themselves. So let's first create a new package and call it service, because we're going to mirror what we've got up here. So we've got a service package. And let's start doing a unit test for our user service. So we get user service test. That's the name of the class. And what we're going to do is we're going to annotate this with @springboot-test. And what this does is it says, this test class, you need to initialize the applications of Spring Boot app, because I've got reliances on that Spring Boot technology. So we come down here and we think, what are we going to need? We're going to need our user service, because that's what we're testing. So we're going to auto wire the user service. Now, normally we do constructor-based injection or dependency injection for this user service. We're going to say auto wired because it's just a bit easier. The reason we do it in our main application is because it's easier to switch out from using Spring Boot to something else if we really needed to. But using auto wire just makes it a bit easier. And it's also kind of a performance thing as well. So we've got our user service. So let's think about the user service. Let's look in it. What do we have? We've got 3 methods here, right? We've got our register user. We've got another private method, but we don't really count that because we'll be testing it via the other methods. We've got a login user, and we've got a verify user. So that's 3 methods we need to write tests for. So let's start with the register user, shall we? So we're going to put @test at the front, and this tells JUnit 5 that this is a test method that needs to test. And what we're also going to do is we're going to put transactional above it. Now, what does doing transactional mean? So transactional means that when Spring Boot runs this test, it starts up the session and it knows that this whole method is going to be one whole SQL transaction. And the beauty of doing that is that when the test finishes, it will actually reverse all of those data changes. Because, say for example, we go in here and we're going to authenticate the user B account. Well, other tests would be expecting user B to still be unauthenticated or unverified, should I say. Well, this is a way of making sure that when we do that, it gets reversed after. So we're going to give it a public method. It's going to return nothing, and we're going to go test register user. Okay, so let's see. What's the first thing? What do we need to use our user service.register user? We need a registration body. So let's build that up. So registration body is equal to a new registration body. And if we come in here in the registration body class, notice we only have get methods, so we need set methods for this now. So let's drop this, and well, so on IntelliJ, in case you didn't realize what I'm doing, you can hold Alt and press Insert, and it will give you these generate methods, which makes it a bit easier. I want getters and setters, and I want it for all of these, and hit OK, and it will generate the get set methods for us. So we're going to do body, and we're going to do body dot set username, because we're going to try and the first thing this registration. I'm sorry, I should have made that more clear what I'm doing. So the register user, the first thing we check to see is the email or the username already existing. So let's test this bit first. All right. So we're going to set the username to be user A, because we know that's an existing user already. The rest of the information we're going to set as normal. So this is going to be what I like to do is when we're using, so we know, you know how we have user A and user B for our static data. Well, to make it really personalized to the test so it doesn't conflict with anything else, a good way to do it is to use the kind of Java method notation. So we're saying user service test $test register user, and that will be our uniqueness to this user that way. So body.set username, we set the email, now let's set the first name, and that we're just going to call it first name because this isn't a unique key. The same with last name. So there we go. And what else do we need to set? We need to set our password. So let's set our password as my secret password 123. So there we go. We've now built up our registration body. We've got a username, an email, first name, last name, and a password. And that's what we need for it. So we know that this username should throw an error. So let's try that. So what we're going to do is we're going to say assertions.assert throws, and we're expecting to receive the user already exists exception that we've built, and the method we're calling is going to be so we're going to use our lambda expression here, and we're going to say user service dot register user body. I'm just going to import this as well. What's it throw? What is it complaining about here? Assertions. I'm using the right one. Assert throws. There we go. And then we're going to give the tester message. So username should already be in use. Be in use. There we go. So that's our first little test. And next, what we're going to do is we're going to go body.set username to be this kind of unique user string that we've got from up here. And we're going to test the email to make sure the email has been correctly checked to make sure that it doesn't already exist. So we're going to change it to user A, and we're going to copy this because it is the exact same test, and we're just going to say email should already be in use. And then when we look back at our registration method, so next we create our user instance. We set a password using the encryption service. Well, we'll test that separately. We do a verification token, which is kind of straightforward, and we send the email verification, and then we save the user. So what we can do to test this in our user service test, we can next do change the body back to its original email, so that we've got the original email here. So this now is a unique user that hasn't been saved yet. And what we can do is we can say assertions.assert not throws, or does not throw. There we go. Assert not does throw. And what this is saying is when we execute this code, no exceptions should be thrown. And we go user service dot register user body. And I'm going to say user should register successfully. And then after that, we also now need to think about our verification email, because as part of this method, it should be sending a verification email. So this is where we come into configuring that Greenmail extension, the Greenmail plugin from earlier. So Greenmail has the JUnit 5 flavor that we imported, allows us to support the Greenmail extension being plugged into JUnit 5. So what we can do is we can do @register extension, and we go private static Greenmail extension equals new Greenmail extension, and we're going to say it's server setup test .smtp, and then we're going to go with configuration, and it's going to be a Greenmail configuration.a config dot with the user, and this is going to be spring boot and secret. Remember, those are from our application properties from earlier. And then finally, we're going to go with per method lifecycle true. And what this is saying is that for every single method that runs, we want to take all the all the emails that have been received and sent, and we want to wipe them between messages, because this register one, we may expect only one email to be in there, and our login test may expect one email to be in there. But if we don't have this set to true, well, then there will be two, because it's not wiping the inbox every time. So what can we do here? So we've now set up our Greenmail extension. So for every method that we're testing anything to do with emails, we're going to need to write this code at the top, right? Now, how can we test with this? So we've got Greenmail extension. What we can do is we can now say, well, we've registered a user, so one email should have been sent. So what we can do is we can actually go assertions.assert equals, and we're expecting there to be one email in that inbox sent to one specific user, and that's it. So we can test that the email being sent to the user is correct. So if we set up here, we know that our email that we've been using is this one. So that's what we expect the string to be. I'm going to say Greenmail extension dot get received message, and this is going to return an array of messages. We're going to form the first one, which is index 0. We want to get the recipients of recipient type, recipient type .to, because it's the to address we're looking for. We're going to get the very first one, and we're going to say toString. And actually, thinking about it, this is not needed. We can just do body.get email, and then that way, if we change this in the future, we don't have to worry about changing it down here. So there we go. We can just drop this down so it looks a bit nicer. And this is going to throw an exception, but since this is unit testing, we don't need to worry about catching every exception under the sun. We just need to make sure that we're catching the exceptions that really do matter. So we can just add that to the method signature, and if it fails, then there's something else going wrong. We need to look at the JUnit. So there we go. So that's that. So let's review what this is doing. So we're building up a registration body with a user we know is already taken. We're verifying that that user is then being rejected. We're then switching the user to a unique user, but setting an existing email. We're going to check again, does this email get rejected? Then we set it to be completely unique, and then we set and we start our registration. We make sure that it is unique and it gets successfully registered. And then finally, we're just checking that our email was actually sent out to say, oh, you've got a verification code to be clicking on. So that's over 30 minutes this episode already, so it's a lot to take in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off the episode here. Next episode, we're going to finish writing the rest of those JUnits for the user service, and we'll see how far we get. But just before it, we're going to quickly just run this, and fingers crossed on the line at the end, we're running this and it works. So I've just right-clicked on user service test and gone run test, and we do have an error. We've got a null pointer. So you know what we're going to do? we're going to stop here and we're going to look at that in the next episode because, as I said, it's already 30 minutes. So I don't want to keep this on too long. So thank you very much for watching. As always, there's a playlist on my channel with all of these videos already set up so you can just watch them start to finish. Please feel free to like, comment any feedback, and subscribe. It helps me a lot, and I will look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thank you very much for watching. Hello, just a quick side note after the video, I figured out what that problem was. As you can see here, I've imported org.junit.test, which is JUnit of 4 and not 5, and therefore is not compatible with @springboot-test. If you remove that import, in case you had imported it as well, and change the test to import the org.junit.jupyter.api, when we run this, we now should hopefully see Spring is actually initializing where it wasn't before, so that was the problem. As you can see, the unit test runs. I'll be uploading this in the code as well, so it should be all good, and I'll see you in the next episode.